Welcome, everyone, to the Fight for Immigrants' Rights panel. My name is Brianna Cominel, and I'm a UCLA law student and the chief executive editor for the Law Review. It is my pleasure to introduce Nubia Willman, who will be guiding us through a very rich discussion with our distinguished speakers. And 15 minutes before the Q&A begins, we will be collecting index cards for anyone who has any questions. So yes, please enjoy.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me, or do I need to bring this closer? Hello? Okay. At my last community meeting, I was told when I worked for the city government that I held my microphone too sassily, so forgive me if my weak wrist give any sort of inference from that. So thank you so much. My name is Nubia Willman. I'm going to be moderating today's panel. I am a former immigration attorney who did about 10 years at a legal aid in Chicago, where I was representing survivors of gender-based crimes. And then I moved on to do local policy government in the mayor's office for the past 4 years. That mayoral administration ended, and I took the summer off, and now I'm at a nonprofit. So I'm not practicing, but I feel like once you're an immigration attorney, you're forever an immigration attorney. So I'm really excited to continue this conversation with these really great panelists. In a second, we're going to go over, they're going to give us their introductions, and then we're going to do some Q&As and allow for space for you to also ask some questions as well. The roadmap for today is really to go over a little bit of the landscape of what immigration law looks like right now, a lot of the forward future looking, especially with the new election coming up, and just concerns for the future and how we all as advocates can help support this really important area. By a show of hands, can you show who here is either a law student or a college student? It'd be just helpful to know. Amazing. And anyone who's sort of practicing but hasn't only been practicing for 5 years or less. I'd just like to see the young professionals. Right on. Forever young. I'm also a forever young professional. Okay, that's perfect. It's just helpful to know our audience, especially where folks are at. And I just wanted to start, we'll do the introductions, and if you could just say your name, where you're from, and then a little bit of how you got into the immigration space. Thank you.
Right. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Maribel Hernández Rivera. I am so excited to see all of you. All of you. This is really exciting, really powerful. I want you to look at each other because you're going to see each other for the rest of your careers. Catalina and I know each other from when I worked at the mayor's office. I see my friend over there, Miranda Galindo. We worked together at Valdez. You know, like, you're going to see each other. Get to know each other. This is your network. These are your people. So how did I come? What do I do? I work at the ACLU. My brother is really funny because they get confused. And he used to say, she works at UCLA in New York. And everybody's like, what? So now that I'm at UCLA, I can say I work at the ACLU. I lead their immigration policy and political advocacy. And I was born and raised in Mexico. I myself was undocumented for a while. My dad passed away undocumented, and that's what basically that's what made me decide that I will do immigration. I have clerked, I have done impact litigation, I have done direct services, worked at the mayor's office, worked for a Congress member, and now I work at the ACLU.
I am going to second that, especially amongst Latinas in the law. It's such far and few in between of us that we could be across the country and we still bump into each other. I'm Catalina Cruz. I am a state legislator in New York. I am the only Latina lawyer in the entire state legislature. And that also, add to that, the city council. There's no one else. And I want to change that, but that's a conversation for another day. I came into immigration law because of my own history. I'm the first former dreamer elected in the state legislature and only the third in the country. And for me, thank you. For me, being an immigration attorney was the only path to giving back to a country that gave me so much that I could see as a plausible thing. I didn't know how I was going to do it because I was undocumented, but as luck would have it, eventually I became a citizen, a permanent resident, a citizen, and then an attorney. I practiced only for a couple of years. I did immigration and labor law. My area of expertise is human trafficking. I realized I did not like clients, and so I went into policy, and it's okay, you can decide that. I am a much better legislator, and I write really good laws, but it just wasn't something that I liked. But I wanted to stick in that area of immigration. I happen to represent the largest community of undocumented people in the state of New York. So for me, it has always been the only path to represent my people. These are people who cannot vote for me, who cannot vote for anyone, but that deserve dignity, that deserve representation, and we'll hear more about that in a bit.
Powerful. Hi, I'm Tania Valdez. I'm currently teaching at the George Washington University Law School. I'm teaching immigration law and torts. One of the reasons why I'm doing that job currently is because I believe strongly that representation matters in law school, and that it is very important for law students to see a Latina faculty member in their very first semester, and also a faculty member who's dedicated to social justice work. So if any of those students are feeling like they're getting knocked off the path, then I can be there to be the dissenting voice. How I got into immigration work, so in my family we say we didn't cross the border crossed us, because my family is from northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, but I recognize that privilege, and it is a huge privilege just to be born on this side of the border, right, is by accident of birth. And so I feel a really strong kinship with immigrant communities, and so I wanted to use the privilege that I have in advocating for immigrants in particular. So before my current position, I had been an immigration lawyer for, I guess, a decade or so, teaching in immigration clinics, primarily in removal defense. I've also represented a lot of LGBTQ+ and HIV-positive immigrants in deportation proceedings. And I've also done some civil rights work, and I worked at the Ninth Circuit as a staff attorney and clerked for a judge in Denver. So that is a bit about me.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Chacón. I'm a professor at Stanford Law School, and I was previously here at UCLA, and so I see some familiar faces from UCLA as well. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, so I had a very clear sense of what the border meant to people in everyday life, and how that shaped everyday life. And I think one of the things that was striking to me when I moved away and moved to, I spent a year working on the Hill in Washington. I went to law school and then clerked for a federal judge on the Ninth Circuit, and sort of thinking about the way policymakers, law professors, legal academics were talking and thinking about the border, talking and thinking about the border region, talking and thinking about immigration policy bore very little relationship to what I knew or saw growing up in that area. And so for me, that was initially a disincentive for going into law teaching and the legal profession, because I thought, this is so disconnected from my experience that the kinds of questions I'm interested in asking and the kinds of changes that I want to see in the world don't map onto what people are doing in law school, so maybe I don't belong in law school. And then I sort of took a step back and realized that maybe that was why I did belong in law school, because we needed to change the conversation, and we needed to change the framing, and we needed to change the ways that lawyers were being trained around these issues, and that there were not people to do that if I decided to see that space. So that's sort of my story about how I came to the Legal Academy. And for those of you who are in law school now and thinking about law teaching, whether now or whether you decide in 5 years you're now thinking about law teaching, I strongly encourage you to reach out to me, send me an email. I'm happy to have a conversation or a coffee to talk about this. It is really important to me, I think to Tania as well, that we really grow this pipeline. If you look at sort of who's on law faculty around the country, it's not particularly representative, and part of that is about sort of bringing people in. And so that's important to me. I know it's important to you, and I just wanted to say that right at the outset that you don't need to know me to reach out to me if this is a conversation that you want to have.
Same.
Thank you. No, that's great. I wanted to level set just so folks knew some of the history and backgrounds as we get into this conversation. But let's jump in because there's a lot to talk about. Maribel, I want to start with you. It's an election year, in case you didn't know. You knew, but in case other people didn't know. And it always seems like around election time, immigration suddenly becomes something everyone is talking about. And at the same time, we have a lot of fear and concern. We have a candidate who just recently said the immigrants are poison to America. But at the same time, we're seeing all this, what folks are calling crisis at the border, lots of concern that perhaps the federal government's not moving fast enough. Interestingly, I read an article from Migration Policy Institute that said the Biden administration had issued over 500 executive actions, orders involving immigration, but it still doesn't seem like enough. And it doesn't seem like it's really getting to the crux of the issue where folks feel safe or folks feel like they have a path forward. So with all of that in mind, what is going on in the 2024 election and just the political landscape overall?
Yeah, so we know Trump is running. He likely will be the candidate. If you want to look up what his immigration plan is, it's already in the New York Times. It was reported in November, and it's worse than what we saw in the last administration, right? My husband has TPS, so when Trump was first in the administration, I was afraid that he was going to get deported because TPS, temporary protected status for people from Honduras, but also other countries, was taken away. And it was only, the only reason why it didn't move forward he didn't move forward with removing TPS is because of there was a court challenge. But of course, Trump did a good job at just putting his people in the courts. So now this time around, we face an even bigger challenge, right? Because in his first administration, we saw the courts really were the first line of defense. And now we have seen what the Supreme Court has done, and we have seen what other courts are doing. So, Trump has said he's going to have sweeping raids, mass raids. He's going to have giant camps. He's going to have mass deportations. And the first time he was running, people just believed that, oh, no, it's not going to happen. And no, he's not going to win. Well, now we know better, right? So we need to mobilize. We need, there was the voting rights panel that we heard at the beginning, that Miranda was there. And she said, we need to tell people to vote. We cannot take this for granted. Immigration, unfortunately, is definitely the issue that the extreme right has taken and will continue to do so from now until the rest of the elections. Very unfortunately, this administration, yes, there have been some good things, but there have also been some horrible things. This administration, especially currently at this moment, there is a negotiation happening between the White House and Congress and the Republicans and Democrats as to, really the negotiations around foreign funding, whether we fund the Ukraine, we fund Israel, we fund Taiwan. But in that negotiation, the really sticking point is what's going to happen to the border. And right now, the reports are that the Democrats and the administration are willing to trade in a ton of rights that asylees have, rights that people have in terms of, who gets detained, who doesn't get detained, just to be able to get foreign aid funding. This is really scary. So basically, they're willing to adopt Trump's policies just to get a win. This is really scary. So I want to say this because we're talking about elections. We're talking about what can you do. This is the moment. They told you, call your representatives. Right now, we need all House members to say, no, we're not going to vote for this deal. Now, I think it's unclear. We're expecting that maybe next week we'll get this framework where it's like, here's what we negotiated and this is what we agree upon. Well, we need a Senate from the vote, a vote from the Senate, a vote from the House, for it to then go to the president. So people can stop it. We do have the numbers for people to stop it, but we need you all. And California is really, really key, as are other states. But sometimes people feel like, oh, California is Democratic, don't worry. It's like, no, because again, we're not just talking about one political party. We're talking about both political parties willing to put trade immigrant rights, trade asylee rights. So to the question about the elections, we know it's going to be an issue. We know we need to continue to fight back. And what I have seen, and this was also mentioned in the previous panels, it's like what we have seen works is mobilization. What we have seen works is people coming out and saying we're not going to take it. That's the only thing that works. Because we right now, unfortunately, are seeing a regression on our rights in terms of immigrants and as asylees.
Thank you. You mentioned fear, and I'm a naturalized citizen, but I remember when the election took over, it was the fear of like, well, what happens if, someone starts to review some paperwork, and it's a real fear. And I think one of the things that settled that concern is that I live in Chicago. Chicago is a welcoming city. I will boast we have the strongest, most protective welcoming city ordinance in the country, meaning that there is no exceptions as to when the government can cooperate with ICE in any type of immigration enforcement. There's no carve-out exceptions. And so that is a really exciting thing that local government is able to do. The state is also a welcoming state. And so I wanted to kick it over to Assemblywoman Cruz because I want to talk a little bit about the local government and what can happen there. Right now, a lot of our cities, New York, Chicago, LA, is really experiencing an influx of folks that are being bused by Texas, right? So we're often thinking about new arrivals. what folks are also labeling as a crisis, a humanitarian need. But there's also lots of things that the local government can do, though historically they have not done resettlement in this way. So there is a lot of struggle there as well. So Assemblywoman, what can you tell us about what local government can do in these types of situations and moments?
So to talk a little bit about what we can, I want to talk to you a little bit about what we have done. And actually, when Maribel and I met each other was when city government, we were both, I was the attorney for the immigration committee at the city council, and you were working for Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, and we were implementing a law that I helped write, which was the detainer law. The detainer law is basically what made New York City into a quote-unquote sanctuary city and kicked ICE out of our city jails. So there are things that if you have the right political will, if you have the right electeds who do not care about the politics but do care about the people, you'll get it done. You know, the former speaker, Melissa Margarito, did not care who was going to come against her. She felt that this was because at that time we thought that the worst crisis was, you know, a couple of thousand children at the border, and here we are. Because we waited for 2 years while the federal government while the Democrats had the leadership at the federal government at every level, and they gave us nothing. And so, yes, we have to go out and vote, but we cannot allow people to forget the promises that they have made to us. Because I have to tell you, and Maribel and I haven't been undocumented, I'm so tired. I am exhausted that the only time they remember us is every 2 years or every 4 years when there's an election. And what happens at the time after that? They forget every single promise, and they count on the fact that because we are Latinos, that we're going to vote for them as Democrats, because the reality is we don't have a choice. The other choice is worst. And so we have to do what we have to do, but do not be afraid to support a candidate who's a Democrat who might change the path of the country, who might change the path of that particular community, because they are going to put people first. And putting that into context at the state and at the city level, there are a lot of things that you can do. You can get creative. I was telling you about my constitutional adjacent bill. I call it that because we don't know if it would ultimately be determined to be constitutional. When New York City in the past year and a half began looking at an influx, I think now we're at 150,000 or so, of new migrants who needed work permits, and the federal government refused. It wasn't that they couldn't, because we saw months later that they put some money into it, they put additional resources, so they can do it. They just refused to initially do it. In the meantime, we had tents, shelters, people who needed work, and no work permits. And these were people who, under the law, recognized internationally, stepped on our borders, said, I need asylum, and I'm simplifying the law, but basically they were following the law of the nation, and they had the right to get a work permit, but the wait, we were looking at 6 months to a year for some people to be able to get a work permit. And so we got a little creative, and we introduced state work permits, and then I don't think it was a coincidence. A week later, the federal government's like, oh, we're going to give the Venezolanos TPS. And so now everybody thinks that things are fine. We don't need work permits, but that's not the case. We have an influx of additional people. We have other countries who still need to qualify for that. And my thought is every state should get creative. Every state should challenge. I know that the Constitution says what it says. I know that there's preemption issues, but when you have a crisis, because this is what that is, it's a crisis, courts have found routinely that the state can step into the shoes of the federal government in a moment of crisis. So our bill, I call it constitutional adjacent, because we wrote it in a way that would challenge that. And hopefully if we pass it, it would then, I know somebody's going to sue us, probably the DOJ, and then let them sue us. I welcome it. And so, that's one example, but there are other things that we have done. In New York, about 10 years ago, we began funding what we hope eventually will become universal legal services. In the same way that when you get arrested, you get the right to an attorney. Our thought in New York is if you're facing deportation, you're basically losing everything in the same way. So why not give you an attorney? So we began with $10 million. Last year, we moved it to $60 million, and it's a bill that I also carry. And my hope is that eventually we could create a model similar to what California has, but a little bit more robust, so that it's automatic. And there's a number of other things. When Trump came after DACA, we introduced a bill that basically would protect the professional licenses of DACA recipients, and expanded it so that it could be used for folks because there are a lot of Dreamers who didn't qualify for DACA because they missed the deadline by a couple of months. And so we wanted to make sure that people who were in our country who had a professional license, but would otherwise not be able to work, wouldn't have to face the loss of that license while the federal government got it together. But there's an infinite number of things. Simply because we don't have the power to control actual immigration law doesn't mean that we as states and local legislatures can't do everything around that. There's the municipal IDs. We did the green light bill, which is for driver's licenses. There is so much that we at the local level can do.
And that's a great segue too for Professor Chacón. I want to talk a little bit. We talk about new arrivals all the time in this space because it is, again, such a big issue that's hitting cities that historically have been very friendly towards immigrants and have been struggling to receive those folks. So we talk about that a lot. But there's so much more to immigration than new arrivals. And we often talk about just the policy, and I want to talk about DACA, as Assemblywoman referenced. DACA has been with us for now over 10 years, and it was an amazing resource that came out, and now it's a little bit stagnant, and now maybe not as useful. Could you give us a little bit about what's going on with DACA, and how is it impacting the folks who can't access that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think you're right. We have a lot of the kind of air in the room around immigration policy right now has been sucked up by questions about what do you do with new arrivals and increasing numbers of new arrivals, particularly at the southern border. And that is a kind of a perpetual cycle. We saw this also in 2016, in 2018, right? You can think about the way that the kind of narrative about policy at the border sucks out all the oxygen for conversations about what we have in the country in terms of a long time, stable set of individuals who have been here for literally decades, right, without any sort of immigration solution. And so I think it's really important to sort of keep that front and center as these other conversations have. They're interconnected in many ways, but it's also important not to sort of overshadow this really pressing concern. And so one of the longtime hopes in the immigration world has been comprehensive immigration reform. That sort of term has been batted about. It's meant different things at different times. It usually involves some sort of bargain when you're seeing kind of a promise of increased enforcement measures and lots of additional spending on enforcement measures in exchange for some sort of legalization packet for some subset of people who are residents in the country and have been here for some time. And so we saw conversations around that. Well, we've seen them endemically, but in 2013, I think is the kind of most recent time we've seen bills actually moving to what seemed like it might get us somewhere in Congress, and it didn't happen. And out of that, sort of in the kind of lead up to that, we saw the Obama administration develop the DACA program and announced the DACA program, which essentially is not, I think most people in this room are probably very familiar with DACA. Some of you probably have it, or you certainly have family members who have it, or have sort of moved through it as a status. But it's not in the immigration statute as a status, right? So you're not sort of on a path way toward lawful permanent resident status or green card. You're not, and so it is a promise of non-enforcement, essentially, right? You will not be removed, and you get work authorization. That's what DACA does. So it's. I think if you look at the social science around kind of the recipients of DACA, it is stunning, just how how that has just been nothing but a win for the United States, just in terms of sort of getting people kind of taking advantage of everybody's capabilities more robustly than was possible when individuals didn't have a chance to move into the formal labor market. So they're, taking advantage and getting to kind of reach their full educational potential, feeling more safe and secure. So real mental health and physical health benefits and access to health care, right? Those things are all wins that are undebatable. But it's incomplete and it's under siege. And so I want to talk about sort of the incompletion of it, right? So first of all, it's limited. It was limited at the outset in terms of who could benefit from it. And that was controversial, right? So you had to meet certain requirements. You talked about the dates as well, right? So there's sort of arbitrary date cutoffs. So it meant only a very limited pool of people were going to be eligible for that. And that was, some of that tapped into the politics of respectability around immigration, who was worthy, who was deserving, right? And so there were those problems. When the Obama administration moved to expand that in the failure of immigration reform in 2013, he announced the Deferred Action for Parents program, the DAPA program, and the DACA expansion, DACA Plus, which suffered from many of the same problems around sort of who was in and who was out, but would have substantially expanded the number of people who were under this umbrella. That program was challenged by Republican administrations in Texas in particular, on Constitutional and Administrative Procedures Act ground, and it never went into effect, right? So it was enjoined by a federal district court judge. That injunction was held in place by the Fifth Circuit, and ultimately the Supreme Court declined to decide the matter, so that held that injunction in place, and then Trump was elected. So there was no way Trump was going to roll out DACA Plus and DAPA. So those programs that would have expanded that relief died. So here we are now, more than 10 years after the announcement of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was supposed to be a temporary stopgap measure on the path toward more robust forms of belonging and status. And all we have still is DACA. There have been some people who have successfully navigated to other and more secure statuses in a variety of ways. There are possibilities, but it's complicated. There are some people who are still in DACA status, even though that was promised as a temporary stopgap. It is the only thing that many residents have. So there's that. And the same people who were excluded before still have never found a way in. And because of the dates and the cutoffs, new people, and because of an injunction that stops new people from coming in, no one new is coming into the program. So lots of people who have been here for long periods of time throughout their childhood are not getting this same kind of protective relief. So those are the limits of DACA. And I think, and I think the other kind of limit is that we see it's being challenged in courts again, right? The same people who challenged DAPA successfully are now bringing challenges to DACA using the DAPA litigation as their both roadmap and as their precedent for why this program is unconstitutional. So it remains vulnerable to legal attack as well. And so what are the solutions for that? Given all of that, kind of given that it's limited, shrinking, and under attack, right? Which I think is the way to think about it. I think we keep hearing that Congress needs to act, and we keep seeing nothing. And I think what you were just talking about is when they do get in a room and do negotiate, it's not in hopeful ways, and it tends to cut this part of the conversation out completely. So instead, we're talking about how do we increase restrictions for new arrivals, how do we increase the funding for that, and not about sort of what do we do about the fact that we are not a democratic society and we have so many people who are sort of outside of the system, who have been living here and participating here and working here and raising families here and being in churches here and organizing here and mobilizing here and being part of the political process here, right? We're not having that conversation at all when we see the way that people in Washington are framing it. So that's troubling, but it doesn't mean we don't keep pushing for that. I think we have to, especially given the litigation peril for DACA. And then I think the states and localities are, again, there's limits to what they can do. They can't bestow status. But I think it's been meaningful and important that states and localities have tried to create at least, kind of thought about how they want to structure their cooperation with the federal government when it comes to enforcement initiatives and try to make their spaces safer. That matters, right? So that's one intervention. And then I think I was really excited to hear the way you're thinking about sort of policy innovation at this level that sort of takes advantage of the fact that federal immigration law doesn't cover the full ground when it comes to the lives of immigrant residents, right? There's a lot of space. And I think restrictionist states have been very innovative about how they want to use that space. And they push the envelope about how much space states and localities have. And I think that those jurisdictions and localities that are friendly to their immigrant residents could do more to innovate in those spaces and to sort of push out what the conception is about what localities and states can do in that space. And if we've seen it on one side, we can see it on both sides, right? So there's opportunity for innovation from states and localities, and that innovation can be roadmaps for where the federal government can move and can create space for that. So I think there are reasons for and I guess the final thing I'll say is I think one of the things that's come out of this conversation in a lot of different rooms is thinking about narrative change and language change. And I am always surprised by how you go to different spaces and this conversation sounds so different depending on where you are, right? What language is used to describe a problem, what language is used to describe an opportunity, what language is used to describe people, really differs from space to space. That language really matters. Being attentive to sort of what is being said and how things are being said and intervening in those conversations in ways that sort of make people think. Sometimes people who are not even bad meaning, right, but make people think about how they're framing a conversation as a crisis when there's no crisis, or when something that's entirely predictable and foreseeable is seen as an unforeseen emergency, right? I think it's really important for us to be attentive to when and how that's happening, and to be careful, and to encourage the people that we know and love to also be careful about what they're doing and saying.
Thank you so much. There's just just by itself, DACA has so many lessons. I think when it always circles in my head is just the idea of leading through executive order and how it leaves it ripe for litigation and how that can lead to other decisions. But folks are so eager for a decision and action. It's so complicated. Professor Valdez, I want to go to you because we talk a lot about policy. There's also litigation in immigration. And I'd like if you could speak a little bit about what that litigation looks like in the immigration space, because I feel for those of us who have practice, we know it's like an upside down world, but not everyone seems to know that or, could use a little bit more info. So could you just give us a little bit background of immigration, litigation, and what that really entails for the folks in proceedings?
Yeah, so I have represented a lot of people in deportation proceedings, right? And here's another example of how the language that we use reflects our perspective, right? That in the law, the word is removal, which is a very sanitized way to say ripping people from their communities, right? So I usually talk about deportation, even though as a lawyer, that's like the incorrect legal terminology to use in a lot of these circumstances. But how I think about that practice is really just like how much the deck is stacked against immigrants. And that happens in so many ways, right? From like the policy level and from the nationwide discussions that happen, right? That we have not just the good, bad immigrant narrative out of one of our political parties, but also from the other, right? That both of our major parties seem to be in agreement that some immigrants are simply not deserving of being here because of crimes that they have been convicted of. And when I say convicted, remember that about 93% of convictions come from pleas. And again, thinking about the language that we use, I will never call it a plea deal because it is never a deal for the person who takes it, right? Because people have a right to a jury trial in criminal proceedings and so on and so forth. So people are often coerced into taking plea offers because they fear the ramifications if they are convicted, right? And especially if you're living in a certain county around the nation where you're not going to see a jury of your peers because non-citizens cannot serve on juries, then often the pressure is on to just take a plea. So I also think a lot about just the immense power of the government, right? So immigration proceedings are recognized as civil, therefore the protections that attach in criminal proceedings do not attach, right? So No right to a lawyer at government expense. The rights against self-incrimination is limited. You're not entitled to a jury trial in immigration court. You are not entitled to cross-examine people that have brought complaints against you, and immigration judges end up taking, like if a police report has ever been filed, they will often take it as truth without the opportunity to cross-examine the complaining person or the officer who took the report or any of those sorts of things. So that's one way that the deck is stacked, right? Another is the immense surveillance power of the state that we are seeing and that luckily is coming to light because of the great work of organizations around the country, like including Mi Gente, Just Futures Law, and other places that are doing FOIA requests and trying to get information about what the government is doing to surveil non-citizens and people involved in, for example, organizing protests about immigrant rights, that it turns out that ICE is going in plain clothes and observing. They're looking at people and like following their social media accounts. They're buying, like, has anyone ever used LexisNexis, right? They're one of the data brokers that sells information to ICE. And so ICE can get people's utility information, their cell phone bills, their home addresses based on their use of gas and electrical services, and they just purchase that without a warrant, right? So this type of surveillance is what I mean when I talk about the government has access to so much information versus when you have the migrant on the other side who, again, often doesn't have access to a lawyer, and especially because detention continues to be at extremely high rates, right? Like it has reduced since the Trump administration, but not as much as one would hope. And so it's incredibly difficult for people who are detained to obtain documents from their case, right? Like think about someone who's been living by themselves and they've now been evicted because they're in immigration detention, and so all of their documents that might prove something about their case are gone, right? So that's what I mean by deck being stacked in that way. We're also just in this era of incredibly aggressive immigration enforcement, and that does not seem to be going anywhere. So as I was reflecting on just, since I started practicing essentially under the Obama administration, and then I was doing removal defense for the last part of Trump's presidency, and then now under Biden, things have not changed as much as I had hoped. And so that has been another takeaway. One other thing I wanted to be sure to mention too, especially in light of the plenary panel that's coming up next, is just that the rights of LGBTQIA plus people and other immigrants with intersecting identities are just not accounted for. That includes, indigenous backgrounds, right? Like people who don't speak the majority language of different countries. This is also including immigrants with disabilities that our immigration laws historically have excluded explicitly people who were deemed, I quote, lunatics, right? Were not allowed into the country, and our current admissibility rules now still say that people can be excluded on the basis of a physical or mental disorder, right? And so there are ways that our laws explicitly are targeting people with disabilities, but also that on the flip side, when you have folks in removal proceedings, again, lacking counsel or there are competency proceedings in immigration court, but it's different from how it functions in the criminal system, where there the question is someone really competent to work with their lawyer? And if they're not, then they cannot be put to trial. In immigration court, the test is, or rather it just looks at if you've been appointed an attorney, then you are deemed competent to move forward with your case. So people who are incompetent can be deported as long as they have been afforded a lawyer. And if someone is incapable of or unable to communicate with their lawyer what their story is, where they came from, it doesn't matter if they have a lawyer, right? And so there are just so many ways where these intersecting identities clash, and that, and it's not the fault of the identity itself, it's the fault of our legal system for not accounting for those things. So I wanted to be sure to talk about that in terms of the challenges as well. And then just one final note on challenges of representing people in removal proceedings is when you yourself feel, like I described at the beginning, a kinship with the folks that you're representing, and you're doing deportation defense, and you're representing primarily people with criminal convictions, it gets very heavy because you lose a lot, right? So it's dealing with the emotional components of that, and especially when you walk into court, and I don't know how many times I've been mistaken for like the interpreter, or the judge calls me by my client's name and my client by my name, or, like the list goes on and on, that I'm always assumed to not be a lawyer. And so you have to take all of those things, figure out how to deal with them. But to the law students in the room especially who are considering going in this direction, it is the most rewarding work. Like, I have zero regrets about doing it, and I still have a client remaining now, and I plan on picking up more cases as I move forward, because there is just nothing more rewarding, even when you lose at the end of the day, than listening to people's stories, making sure that those stories get told, and pushing for people's rights. And to your point also about just litigation more broadly, right, is that you're not only representing that individual person, but the arguments you make have the potential to affect the law. If you take a case to the Supreme Court, you have the potential of affecting immigration law across the nation as a whole, right? So it goes from individual representation to much larger scale.
Thank you. I know we gave you a lot of information. I think it's time to collect the cards. So you can make them, and if you haven't had a chance, you can write down some of your questions and they'll be collected, and then we'll try to get through as many as we can. As that is being done, I think I wanted to summarize some of the things we've heard, because I know we threw a lot of information at you because this is such a complex topic. But I think from the front of mind that I got was advocate no matter what. No matter if you are in a state that seems friendly or not, you should not take anything for granted. You should look for leaders who want to do the right thing, regardless of the politics. You want to get creative and innovative and push your local and state and federal leaders to do the same. That language matters. And even though this work is very heavy, and it is very rewarding and worth it. I think with that, we have our questions. Thank you. All right, give me 1 second just to...
I know.
Remember being 16,
Okay.
17 when they announced the DREAM Act, and I'm like, I'm 41 years old.
2000.
So we're still waiting. Yeah, still waiting. We're good for the pictures.
Yeah, right. Okay, I'm going to start with this one because I think this is very awesome. As a child of immigrants and family of immigrants, how do you transition from having your immigrant status being such a huge factor of your life to being an immigration attorney?
I can start. I actually find it to be a plus. I am proud to be a formerly undocumented immigrant. I became an immigration attorney because my dad was undocumented and died undocumented. He was in a car accident in South Carolina. At that moment, I was in Mozambique. My brother, who's back there, was in the Navy in Japan. The family was not notified that my father had been killed in a car accident, even though my father had his driver's license with him, with his name and address, even though he had a cell phone that could have just picked up and called the family. We were not notified. The way we learned about my dad's passing was days later. He was a handyman, so he was supposed to do a job. He had hired a young person to work with him, and that young person was waiting. So then he just picked up the phone and called, where are you? And the person on the other line who answered was the owner of the junkyard where my father's car had been taken. And he's the one who notified that young person, and then we got the information. So I say this because that is the reason why I became an immigration attorney. I was in Mozambique because I was trying to decide, do I do international development work or do I do immigration work? So that was decisive to me. So that marked me. I wanted to help my dad change his immigration status. That didn't work out, but I'm like, I want to help other people like him to get immigration status. But more than that, I want to help other people like him get their stories out there. I want to make sure that I'm fighting. So I know what I can tell you to the point of your identity being so important. Previous to this job, I worked for Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, and I was her first district director. I did not work in her campaign, so the chances of me getting a job as a congressional job were slim because she didn't know me. I hadn't worked in that. But the reason she chose me out of 1,000 applicants was because of my immigration, both personal background and professional background, because her district, it's in the same district as Assemblymember Cruz, and most of her constituents are immigrants. So the constituent services we were providing, 80% of those services were immigration related. So the fact that I knew that information, that not only did I know it professionally, but also personally, right? I could relate to our constituents. That's really important. I could understand what they were going through. And so for me, the fact that immigration, and if you Google me, I think it's Maribel and immigrant. Those are the two things that come up. And I'm proud of that. And I will continue to do that because that is where I come from. And I'm very proud to now have the privilege to be able to work for other people who, like my father, didn't have their voices heard.
And, to the person who asked the question, I challenge you to think of it differently. Why would you want to? In a country where people that look like us, who have our backgrounds, are constantly told that we are not good enough to be in any of those rooms, not in a jury room to pick a jury, not on the bench, not an elected official, not as a professor. You come with a set of life experiences that other people don't. You know what it's like, probably know what it's like to face a possible deportation. Probably know what it's like to face a possible eviction. You probably know what it's like to have a parent who lost their job and doesn't know how they're going to pay for their rent the following month. Why would you want to be anything but exactly that? When I talked about not liking clients, I probably should have framed it differently. It was a lot. I chose to do the other impactful work because emotionally I couldn't do it anymore. And that's okay. And so think of it differently. You might not be able to do it this way, but there's going to be another way for you to do something exactly that or bigger. But never, ever, 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 ever change exactly who made you who you are. When I ran for office, my undocumented mother was the center of my campaign, not me, my mother. My mom who had collected cans, my mom who used to give out flyers, my mom who used to clean people's houses, my mom who had a full nursing degree in Colombia and couldn't exercise her profession. Because of that is that I am where I am. So because of your parents and your lived experiences, that you're gonna be a better lawyer, a better professor, a better anything than whoever else is next to you.
I'll move on so we can get a few more questions. So during the 2016 campaign, attacks on birthright citizenship seemed far right. Now it seems Vivian Miller's plans seem more mainstream. What does the Constitution owe our community of citizens and non-citizens, and how do we move towards the mandating, I think it says all citizenship?
Yeah, so I think this is another exercise of watching the Overton window in action, right, where things that seemed like they were off the table are now squarely on the table and being debated as mainstream possibilities. Birthright citizenship is a constitutional right. There was a civil war fought over this. It is not hard. You can read expert constitutional law scholars of many political persuasions, all reaching the same conclusion. This is not difficult, and yet, right? And yet here we are, and yet, it seems like we are moving to a place where there may be legislative and, depending on who wins the presidency, executive efforts to tamper with this. The sort of practical implications of actually tinkering with birthright citizenship are monumental. The challenges cannot be understated, right? You can think about not just people in this room, but people all over the place whose citizenship comes into question when you start to play with that baseline. So I think, but do we need to be concerned? Absolutely. And would I have said we needed to be concerned about this 15 years ago? Probably not, right? And that just shows the way that the sort of the framework has changed, right? What is on the table, what is possible, what is potentially legitimate is being, it is moving. And so I think we need to be mindful of that. I think we need to be prepared and out in front of that and ready, informed, both on the constitutional law, which is quite straightforward, but also on the politics, right? Because constitutional law it ultimately is a feature of politics, right? We can think about the Second Amendment, which means something very different now than it meant 50 years ago, and that's because the Second Amendment is different because the politics of it have changed. So the Constitution is not a sticky thing that means one thing. It is something that moves with the political winds, and we need to be prepared to take that on and to shape the politics in order to ensure that those rights still have meaning and that we can hold on to them.
And just very briefly, I think people think that because it's so difficult procedurally to change the Constitution, because you have to, if it works like the way that it works in the state legislature, you have to pass this several times. it's actually not the only way.
Yeah.
If somebody sues, it's going to go to a Supreme Court that's stacked with people that he put there. So we can't get complacent and think, oh, just because it looks hard, that it's not going to happen. So,
But also, because I know it gets really like, as you know, as an immigrant, sometimes we're like, oh my gosh, is there any hope? If they can move the Overton window, if they can
We
move what's
can too.
mainstream, so can
We
we.
can too.
And we saw with DACA. DACA was something that people didn't think could happen. But it was the youth, the undocumented youth who were unapologetic, and they made it happen. So again, let's not give up hope. We need to just keep on fighting.
Professor Valdez, I think this might be one for you. What can lawyers and advocates do to stop the harmful effects of the rocket docket, dedicated docket, / dedicated docket?
Yeah, so the rocket docket or dedicated dockets are referring to expedited deportation proceedings, especially for people who are recent arrivals, right? And yeah, so I did a lot of the rocket docket cases when that first started happening under the Obama administration because he had family and unaccompanied minors for some reason on the rocket docket. And so what that meant for people is that they would get expedited proceedings, the way that administrations tend to defend that, including from Democratic Party, right, is that it means that people will win their cases faster. But how can that happen when people's cases are coming up so fast they have zero ability to get a lawyer, especially when they have just gotten here. They don't have work permits, right, because you have to accrue 6 months presence after filing an asylum application in order to obtain the work permit in the first place. So on rocket docket, people didn't have the opportunity to do that. People can't afford lawyers. There's limited numbers of providers who can do pro bono services, right? So that had huge impacts for a lot of those families, and a lot of people were deported there. And I think, like, for people who are interested in the broader issues, right, there's always opportunities for impact litigation around these issues, like making sure that you're preserving legal arguments. Like, if you are arguing in immigration court and you're arguing your best for your client's individual case, like based on the facts of what they've experienced and, you know, that they qualify for asylum, those things, don't forget about preserving due process arguments and making objections to the idea of rocket docket or expedited proceedings or any of the other number of rights that are being whittled away at in immigration, right? And so preserving the record is one of the best things that you can do at the immigration court level to make sure that if it goes up on appeal, whether it's you or another lawyer who comes in and takes over the appeal, that those issues are preserved. And then for impact litigation also, you know, there are organizations that will sue, like large scale, based on like if regulations have been pushed through without notice and comment period, right? You can file an EPA claim and things like that. So yeah, there are different ways, and I'd be happy to talk more, whoever asked the question, if you want to come up at the end.
But also, what can you do on Monday on this? Because this is one of those issues that is being negotiated on right now. They're trying to expand expedited removal. So again, the fact that you don't get access to a judge, you just get deported right away. So what you can do on Monday, all of you, every single one of you, call your representative and say, no, we don't want you to trade asylum and immigration rights for foreign aid policy. Because not only, it already exists, now they're trying to get a lot more people who are gonna have zero due process before they get deported.
and elected officials listen. When we get our calls like this or emails and it's in mass, we listen.
I think that actually leads great to the next question, which is how do you deal with pushback from residents of the sanctuary cities that we work in, pushback in terms of resource allocation, tax funds, public space usage, especially racially loaded pushback, a lot of NIMBYism. And I think I'll do a point of privilege because here in Chicago, well, not here in Chicago, when I'm in Chicago, Chicago's everywhere. We have a lot of that, and that was when I joked about the mic. That was one of my last community meetings, was we were trying to use an abandoned, an unused high school that was in a community that was historically disinvested, and there was a lot of anger, and rightfully so. But there is a lot of NIMBYism, a lot of anger in a city that has historically always been very immigrant-friendly, if not by the government, but by the principles of the residents. And so it's very difficult as back then, a government representative to see this and kind of maybe see, wow, it's not really as welcoming as we all kind of thought when push came to shove, sometimes literally. But Assemblywoman, I think if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
So I recently had my district redistricted, and I inherited what I like to call the Make America Great Again part of my community. Yeah, it's that bad. So I'm going to do two parts. One is how I do it, and one how I think the majority of elected officials do it. I don't give a fuck. I don't think there's any other way to describe it. I am unapologetic about the issues that I care about and how I'm going to fight for my community. And if you want to be racist and you want to negate the history of this country of not minding our own business, and that's why half of these people are in this country, because we put our noses in politics of another country, then that's fine by me. I'm going to continue to fight for the resources, for the people in my community, the way that I feel is right. And if one day you want to throw me out of office, so be it. But until then, I'm going to do it the way that I need to do it. This came, to light during the pandemic. We were the epicenter of the entire country. And during that time, we weren't getting the vaccines because our people don't vote. We weren't getting the resources because our people don't vote. We were told that we were good enough to deliver your food, to take care of your people, to be at the supermarkets, and for a lot of us to die doing it. And so when fast forward to this year, when we have a migrant crisis, but we still have a lot of undocumented people, I reminded my neighbors, these were the people who were willing to do everything that you couldn't do so that our community could survive. So let's treat them with dignity. And I will call people out in public. I don't care. I will call them out for saying words like illegal. I will call them out for using us as props during pictures. That's fine with me. The majority of my colleagues are a little bit more political about it. They'll have the conversations, they'll try to bring people around, they'll try to explain. I used to try to do that in the beginning, but people are going to be xenophobic and racist, and there's nothing I can do about that, so now I just do what I need to do, and I worry about the rest later. And then I let her worry about it. And I let my chief of staff worry about that later. So.
I think I have two questions that are somewhat similar. They're based here in California. So there's a new ICE processing center that's set to open next month in Concord, California. And the question there is what can be done to protect community? And I think sort of a twin question is, what are strategies to combat the lack of willingness from a Democratic majority government, like here in California, to keep passing legislation that supports undocumented immigrant communities because of political ambition or fear of anti-immigrant narratives? And I think those are two related, and I'll see who in the panel wants to speak to that, but I do also want to mention, because I have to keep promoting Illinois and Chicago. In Illinois last year, we passed a law where there's no more detention centers in the entire state. So there cannot be detention centers in Illinois. Yes, amazing.
Can I get a copy of that?
Okay, so
Can I get a copy of that bill?
And that is due to the organizing, to the collaboration, the coalitions that happen statewide with, and of course then the folks that are the assemblymen and councilwomen and alderwomen in our city and state. So things are possible, but I'm going to kick it over to maybe the Californians or Maribel.
I was just saying, if you are lucky enough to have papers, show up and protest. Because there's people, during DACA, it was the folks who didn't have papers who were putting their everything on the line. And so for something like this means not a civil arrest where they're going to give you a ticket and release you. This is a little bit harsher than that. So do what others can't afford to do.
And also, I would say, you're not alone. Sometimes it feels like, like I said, when I was an immigrant, I didn't think people cared. When I was an immigrant. I'm still an immigrant. When I was an undocumented immigrant, I didn't think people cared. And now that I'm in this, there's so many people. So the first organization that comes to mind, the Detention Watch Network. This is all they do. It's a whole network that is dedicated to make sure that detention goes away, right? So get involved. Again, going back to the undocumented youth, they organized. It wasn't that they were waiting for anybody to come save them. So the part of the question was, how can we push so that Democratic or any administration can continue to create legislation? Well, you got to push, you got to show up at the city council meetings. You got to show up at the various hearings. You got to make that phone call. You got to get other people to make that phone call. That works. And I know it doesn't feel like it, because I can tell you, again, when I was undocumented, I thought that it didn't matter, but it really does matter. I can tell you, just one real example is with these border negotiations, they have been going on since the fall. And we thought anytime we're like, oh my gosh, but every time we keep on pushing and keep on pushing. So the win is that we have delayed it so far. Again, this week we might be seeing something horrible, but we're going to keep on pushing. So it does work.
Just wanted to say to a point that was made earlier also by Assemblywoman Cruz is that for some people, like the avenue for change can be outside the law too, right? Like we don't need everyone to be lawyers. There are many ways to participate. And this issue about detention centers is actually one very important way to be acting outside of the legal realm, right? Because, for example, a lot of immigration lawyers actually opposed the closing of detention centers in their area based on the idea that then their clients would be sent far away, right? Which does, it affects the ability to represent, right? But then so it created this really interesting tension, like it was around the closure of one of the detention facilities in Northern California. And so, you know, this is a way where like taking off the lawyer hat and going out and organizing and protesting and participating in those capacities is really powerful.
Yeah, and I think if you are a lawyer or you're training to be a lawyer, I think being humble as you sort of think about, you know, how you engage in litigation, particularly impact litigation, and thinking about how that aligns or doesn't align with the strategies that are being employed by non-lawyers. I think that's a really important, and it's not taught enough in law schools about you do not always need to be the leader, and often you should not be the leader, right?
Yes.
So it's really important to sort of be a listener rather than somebody who thinks they have all the answers. I think that's critical. And I think the other thing is, for those who have the privilege of being able to vote, voting pragmatically is important. So, you know, you got two options, pick the better one, right? Vote pragmatically, but that doesn't have to change how you advocate. It doesn't have to change how you structure your demands, and you shouldn't feel like you can't advocate and structure your demands creatively, right? I think those two things have to travel together in this moment.
Thank you so much. I know we're at time. So before we say thank you to the panelists who gave us so much good information, so much action steps to take. Thank you. Yes, thank you. I just wanted to thank all of you for being here, being so attentive, and giving us some really great questions. I'm sure we're willing and able to talk to you if you have anything you'd like to do on the side. And just one point of privilege, one of the reasons I wanted folks to mention how they got into immigration is because I know when we get into this space and you get in positions of power, and you start talking about immigration and advocating, folks might say, you're too close to this issue. We're not going to listen to you because you're too close to this issue. And I hope, yes, exactly, that hearing from these leaders and seeing how connected you can be to an issue makes you a better leader, motivates you to keep going and keep working in this space because we need you. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.